I gotta be honest, I never really understood the Kyle Rittenhouse case. Not because I didn't understand what happened, because I'll say this now, and I will say this again throughout this video. It was on tape, and there were multiple journalists around documenting what was going on. But rather, I never really understood why it is that people so powerfully reacted to him, calling him a terrorist, a white supremacist, just generally distracting from the facts of the case and the environment that put him there to begin with. And I also never really understood the tendency of so many people to refuse to understand and accept how clear it was that Kyle acted in self-defense and how observable, in fact, it was, how public the information was to actually verify this for yourself, even as the evidence is right in front of their face. I noticed that so many people are baffled at the rulings and consensus of the jury, some predictably claiming that, oh, white supremacy was the cause and the jury was white and that's why they let him go, and if it were a black guy acting in self-defense, he would have been convicted. All of this having nothing to do with the charges or the events that took place on the video that was played in court and explained at length during the trial. And it is somewhat understandable, but it seems to me that we are all guilty of exporting our own biases and sensibilities onto this case. A good example of this is the prosecution and also people on the left claiming that by virtue of Kyle having a gun at a protest, that this was provocation and an indication that he was going to hurt somebody with this gun. This is coming from people, I find, who don't like guns themselves and or they don't have much experience with their safe and proper use. They see a gun and they reflexively think this person is going to do something with it, or why is it even necessary to carry that around? Often they don't come from strong gun cultures, and this is especially ironic in this case because where it happened, it seems that they have a pretty strong gun culture, and because Kyle was being attacked, people were trying to grab his gun, and in fact, other people with guns in the crowd of people chasing him were firing theirs off in his vicinity and pointing it at him. So if anyone is reckless with guns, it's those that were pointing their guns at Kyle first, as in the case of Gage Grosskreutz, or firing them off in the air, as in the case of that Zeminski guy. So the focus on Kyle in that case honestly makes no logical sense whatsoever. When the rioters were there with guns, they were acting much worse and much more recklessly, pointing their guns at Kyle and shooting in the air. But I digress. There is also state witness testimony that he was there to render medical aid to people, and that he did, in fact, do this at an earlier point in the night. So he wasn't there just to wave his gun around. It seems that he had a gun precisely because he did need it in the course of being there to provide medical aid and because he knew that there was a violent riot going on. The business that supposedly called him to be there had been suffering property damage for a while at that point because remember, this was not a standalone incident. This was a riot that was going on because Jacob Blake was shot. No matter what you think about that situation, which I'm not going to go into now, that's tangential, it doesn't really matter because the protesters were already there and destroying things well before Kyle got there. And they also brought guns with them before Kyle got there. So Kyle was not just walking into a situation where everybody was unarmed and he just had a gun and was waving it at people and hunting people down. No, he was walking into a situation where other people had guns and were being explicitly violent with those guns and with other weapons. And the thing is that we knew that it was a violent riot from the beginning. A store owner who was attempting to put out the fire in his store that was set by these protesters was cracked over the head with a rock. A dumpster was set on fire by these protesters and was being pushed towards a gas station. And I'm sure we all know what would happen if that had actually come to fruition and made it to the gas station and they push it over and everything and sets things on fire and explodes. And they were attempting to block the road as well to just stop emergency services from coming through. Many of these peaceful protesters in the streets that night had weapons, whether they were clubs, chains, guns, or rocks, and were using them against people and threatening people, at times explicitly and verbally. So there's no case whatsoever, all jokes aside, that this was anything approaching a peaceful protest or that these people were just fighting for black lives. They weren't. They were violent rioters, hurting people, destroying things in a poor, as I understand it, black business district. And the question of why was Kyle even there to begin with is an interesting question that I never really understood people not knowing the answer to either. So why was he there? The police weren't doing their job, that's why. In fact, they were there. They just did nothing. They just watched as people were being shot, killed, beaten in the streets. Presumably millions of dollars of property damage was being done, including but not limited to the arson of these local, presumably black-owned businesses. But the most baffling thing to me and the most telling aspect of this case for me, as I alluded to earlier, is that this was all on tape. The trial and the night in question had video evidence to support what happened. We know Kyle was being attacked not only because of the testimony in the televised trial, but also because of the video that was broken down by all parties involved during the trial. There were multiple journalists there, and some of them took the stand and testified in person about what they saw. This has been public information for over a year. There is no excuse for ignorance anymore. Yet many people in my life that have expressed strong opinions about how he's a white supremacist and he should be convicted, or any of the myriad other personal attacks the media has made about him, have never seen the footage and got most of their information, if not all, from corporate media. So there is an element, certainly, of people are just not doing their due diligence. How can you have such a strong opinion on someone, like calling this kid a white supremacist, a racist, a murderer, a mass shooter, terrorist, whatever names are being hurled at him, if you have never even seen the source material for why he's a household name at this point to begin with? Especially if you're a public figure. Like, you're in Congress and saying this stuff, there's no excuse. You're a prominent media personality and you say these things, you have no excuse. I refuse to accept ignorance in those cases. But honestly, for some of us who are busy, they have lives, we didn't pay attention, it's at least a little bit more understandable because you're not completely entrenched in politics and in the news and everything. But I feel like it is worthwhile to mention that it's probably a good thing to not have an opinion on this case if you don't actually know what happened. Stop posting and reposting lies on social media if you don't actually know what happened and you didn't see any of the video and all you're doing is just reading an article or two and thinking, I did my research and I trust the media and I know that this is what happened or whatever. On some level, I can't really blame them though, because many people think that they know because they watch CNN or they read a few articles and they think that they did their due diligence and they're brought up to believe that the corporate media is not lying to them, but in reality, they have no idea. Corporate media is full of ideologues. There are many instances of corporate media not only lying by omission about the events that night, but also instances of overt and provable lies, like the one from The Independent that claimed that Kyle killed 3 black men before they had to change that so they don't get sued for defamation. And also some top Brazilian media outlets had to retract their stories because they claimed the same thing, which, again, this is all on video, so this should be basic biographical information that you don't get wrong. And I would say probably at this point, they deliberately got it wrong to push a narrative that he is, in fact, a white supremacist because, and the reason I say that is because the media in the US was so often pushing that narrative and is even doing that now after the verdict has come in. Like the numerous articles that have come out saying that white supremacy made this possible, that this is an example of white privilege, and just making this into a big race issue when it at no point had anything to do with race. No black people were shot. The police did not brutalize anyone. In fact, their hands-off approach created the environment to allow this to happen in the first place. Yet suddenly, this is some type of affront to racial justice that Kyle was acquitted of killing 2 white people and that he was let off because the evidence was clear that he was being attacked and chased by a mob of people. It was all on tape, so you can literally just watch what happened. Even besides that egregious example, there are many aspects that were favorable to Kyle's case that were glossed over, and there was a lot of manipulation of the narrative to try and stack public opinion against Kyle, misleading the public about the basic observable facts about what happened in so doing. We are too trusting, honestly, and I think a lot of people are waking up to that the corporate media basically lied to you about this entire case for a year, and we kind of assume that there was no nefarious intent because it's the job of the media to hold people accountable and tell the truth. But at this point, this is sunshine and rainbows levels of idealism. The media is not interested in truth, and I think they've aptly demonstrated that through their coverage of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. If they were, there would be a much more balanced perspective coming out of these media companies and much more of a discussion about the basic facts of the case. And they would actually get the basic facts of the case correct. Why? Because it's on video. But instead, you get opinion piece after opinion piece, lie after lie, and spinning of the facts of the case and misrepresenting the facts of the case and outright stating falsehoods about the facts of the case to fit a particular narrative. You get very little discussion of the other side of the argument. And remember the thing that I mentioned earlier where that store owner was cracked over the head with a rock by protesters for trying to put out the fire that they set in his store? Well, that story was held by editorial staff and wasn't released until after the 2020 election, some 3 months later. Why? Because they're interested in the truth, or because they wanted to mitigate the political backlash? The bottom line is that the media was derelict in their duty to report the news as it happened and as the situation developed. They didn't tell the truth or give a balanced picture of the events. They pushed a narrative, they were wrong, and even continued after the verdict came down to double down on a politically contrived racial narrative that is seemingly detached from the video evidence and testimony from on-the-ground journalists that were actually there. So on some level, I can't really blame my friends and family for coming at it this way, the way that they did. If they got a balanced media diet that gave you a clear picture of the events, maybe they would have had a more balanced perspective. But on the other hand, if it's on tape, watch the tape before you come to any conclusions. Don't just trust the media. Look for yourself. I have a busy life too, I'm a graduate student myself. I don't really have time for this. But if you want to be aware of different cultural events enough to have an opinion on them, you can't just come at it so cavalierly and make and propagate claims on social media and through corporate press without knowing what the hell that you're talking about. False media narratives are a real thing that happens seemingly pretty frequently nowadays, especially with the advent of powerful camera phones and people getting incidents on tape from potentially multiple angles, as was the case in this particular incident. This was huge in the case of George Floyd, and this was used in the media to create a powerful reaction to his killing. Not to say that the video itself was a false narrative, but the idea that the killing had anything to do with race was not even mentioned in the trial at all because it was immaterial and is at best speculation. Yet it ginned up a massive narrative where not only he was called white supremacist, the officer himself, but the institution of policing was accused as such, justifying the defunding of police departments across the country, which led to spikes in violent crime wherever it happened. Similarly, in this case, the picture of him in the bar with the free as shirt has been brought up multiple times in my conversations with others as indications that he didn't have remorse, or even this was used to claim that he's a white supremacist or that he's drinking underage and violating his bond or something like that. Meanwhile, they were completely unaware that those who were killed were white, were attacking him, threatening his life, like basic biographical information about the case, and that other people in the crowd had guns and were firing them off in his vicinity. So this is what a corporate media diet on this case will likely give you. Some racial narrative, an endless discussion of the social politics surrounding this racial narrative, as you remain ignorant about the basic facts of the case, and even explicitly wrong details about the case, like that those dead were black men. And this was actually propagated through corporate media as well. So propagating this stuff has a real impact on public opinion. And I think that it's just an important point to make sure that the next time something like this happens, like say the attack on the holiday parade that closely followed the verdict, or the trials of police-involved shootings, whether you feel the evidence is clear or not, do a deep dive yourself before you come to conclusions, because maybe your initial impressions or biases might be wrong, the media might be lying to you, they might be trying to spin a narrative, and the only way to find out for sure and to get a balanced perspective of the world around you is to see and think for yourself. If it doesn't change your mind, then fine, but at least you looked through a balanced set of sources from different political perspectives maybe, and areas of expertise. At least you have a more varied set of information from which to draw conclusions. If we all do that going forward, we'll be better off. But somehow I suspect that that won't happen, And the fact that this was so heavily documented, yet so many people remain willfully uninformed, and yet spout a bunch of BS on social media and corporate media, indicates that we are so polarized and we engage with news in such a passive manner, and the media landscape is so toxic that we will never get everyone on the same page under any circumstances, no matter how clear the evidence is, no matter how thoroughly documented any of these events are. But I suppose I'm an optimist at heart, so I'll just wait and see if things get better in that respect.